Mr. Evans, welcome to IESE. You are one of the world's thought leaders in all sort of internet topics and recently also Web 2.0. And I guess it will be very interesting for our audience to get some insights from you regarding business. So let me briefly make some questions here. First of all, we would like to know, how do you think can harnessing Web 2.0 deliver cost savings or competitive advantage to the traditional business?
Most people don't think of Web 2.0 as a way to save money. They think of it as a way to build communities, tap into the imaginations and enthusiasms of customers or employees. But interestingly, I think it actually is a surprisingly cheap way of doing things. One way of thinking about Web 2.0 inside the company, for example, is that it's a way to let the employees do things without bosses needing to plan or control. And for that very reason, it can be quite surprisingly cheap. I was talking just last week to a client of my company, the Boston Consulting Group, who is in the airline industry. His company is one of the very large American airlines. And he said that some of his colleagues developed a Web 2.0 application, what's called a mashup, where they combined different kinds of information in order to create a totally new service. And he got a request from the accounting department for a cost allocation for this activity. And it was a real problem because it had been done over the weekend and it didn't actually cost anything. So he had to invent, eventually, he had to invent a $10,000 charge just in order to justify to the accountants the fact that this was a real project. So surprisingly, sometimes Web 2.0 projects can be quite remarkably cheap.
Besides being remarkably cheap, we also tend to think about Web 2.0 projects of having some risk, right? Yes. And some opportunity too. Yes. But as these tend to be like sort of under the cover initiatives very often, I think that we tend to think that there's some risk here too. What would you say to companies to reduce the risk while exploiting the opportunity that it makes?
You have to be selective. It is simply reality that corporations have legal liability, they have intellectual property, they have accountabilities, regulations, which they have to conform to. So corporations cannot take risks that individuals take very easily. That's simply a reality. On the other hand, I think that corporations often tend to be too risk-averse, and they don't recognize opportunities when they are presented. So, for example, there was a Web 2.0 advertising campaign created by Chevrolet, the American car brand, for a big truck called the Tahoe, and this is an enormous gas-guzzling, politically very unfashionable vehicle. And the idea was that they published on the internet a lot of movie shots of the Chevy Tahoe being driven in exotic places and looking very attractive. And then people were invited to take these film extracts, combine them with music and words, and create an advertisement for Chevrolet. And what happened was that the environmental groups discovered this and created lots of advertisements attacking the Chevrolet Tahoe for being a gas guzzler, for being bad for the environment, and so forth. And this looked like a major disaster for Chevrolet, because of course all of this happened in the public domain and Chevrolet could not really stop it. Well, the interesting thing is that this Chevy Tahoe advertising campaign was probably the most successful campaign that Chevrolet have ever run. And the reason, of course, is that the kind of people who buy Chevy Tahoes are the kind of people who would regard gas guzzling and not being green as badges of pride, not badges of shame. And so although it looked like a disaster, it actually turned out to be a success. And I think that point is actually fairly general. What happens is that the risks are perceived as being greater than they really are, and some loss of control is often more than compensated by the enthusiasm and the energy and the attention which Web 2.0 innovations can capture.
And in this sense, I guess that you would encourage companies to generally start online experiences for the clients, right?
Yes, I would. It's not, as I say, it's not universal. It's not true that every company should use Web 2.0 techniques. But for customer relations, for innovation, for process improvements or learning across the company internally, for relationships between the company and its own suppliers, those are the kinds of applications where Web 2.0 can be very effective. But if you're running a nuclear power station and the aim is to avoid making mistakes that will kill millions of people, I would not recommend Web 2.0 as a way to do it.
Certainly not. You briefly mentioned the impact of Web 2.0 for the company itself, yes, for the relationship with employees. Can you describe a bit more about how do you see Web 2.0 impacting on things like employee, yes, empowerment? Well,
it's proved surprisingly powerful, but I think companies are still learning about what works and about what doesn't work. One of the most aggressive experimenters has been IBM. And IBM have tried a very wide range of Web 2.0 techniques, even including operating about 15 or 16 islands within Second Life, the video game. There are about 4,000 or 5,000 people in IBM who have Second Life accounts, and they quite literally have corporate meetings inside the game where people turn up with wings or strange costumes or the opposite sex, and this is actually proving to be a very interesting platform for collaboration. That may be more gimmick than reality, I don't know. But what is interesting is that IBM have held a series of events which they call innovation jams. And an innovation jam is essentially a threaded discussion over a period of a few days around a particular theme. And they have involved sometimes over 100,000 of their own employees, 100,000 employees, in these kinds of improvised working sessions. You could not do that in the physical world. You cannot get 100,000 people together in the physical world. And out of those innovation jams have come dozens and dozens of ideas for new products or how to improve processes that IBM are now putting into serious development. And they strongly believe that it is proving to be a very effective way of tapping the energies of their own employees.
Probably IBM does, because, and many companies probably would agree in that collaboration sounds cool, but I also think that very often these companies also fear that this general sharing has an impact on their intellectual property. Indeed. And yes, therefore on the competitive advantage. Yes. So for these companies that are still fearing, what would you tell them?
Well, I tell them a couple of stories which suggest that intellectual property may be better shared than hidden. The first story is the story of Boston's Route 128 in its competition in the 1980s with Silicon Valley. Back in the 1970s, 128 in Boston was the world center of the electronic industry, and it lost that role to Silicon Valley, which continues to be the center to this day. And economists and sociologists have studied very carefully why it was that Boston lost. And interestingly, the reason they concluded was that in Silicon Valley, intellectual property was shared. Not entirely, but significantly. It wasn't shared because companies wanted to share it. It was shared because it was essentially stolen. Employees would move from one company to another. Investors would invest in one company and then another. The chief engineer of one company would leave and start his or her own company. And through all of these mechanisms, ideas spread through the valley. That diluted the reward to innovation, of course. But it also reduced the cost of innovation because everybody else now had access to those ideas, which otherwise had been secret. In Boston, the secrets were preserved much more effectively by these big companies which were like walled castles, Data General, Digital Equipment, Wang, Polaroid, and so on. And interestingly, the innovation rate in California was far faster than the innovation rate in Massachusetts. So the general principle that that story suggests is that just as there is benefit to giving people the reward for intellectual property, there is also benefit from giving people access to intellectual property. Linux is an extreme example of what happens when everybody has access to intellectual property. There are many other stories, I think, that reflect the same kind of logic, which suggest that in some contexts, the sharing of intellectual property can actually result in greater benefit. In the drug industry, the large pharmaceutical companies have lost a lot of their capacity to innovate in favor of the smaller biotech companies. And the great advantage that the biotech companies have is a much greater degree of sharing of intellectual property. So the lesson I would draw is not that intellectual property doesn't matter, but it is that a system, a world, an environment in which many companies deliberately or even accidentally are sharing can actually be a much more productive and much more innovative environment. And that's why it is, for example, that so many companies are actually writing code for Linux, putting their content in the public domain, why it is that even Microsoft, one of the companies always cited as the aggressive protector of intellectual property, even Microsoft in many contexts is putting its technologies into the public domain because they believe that they gain more from making it accessible, spreading it, and allowing people to build on it than they lose from compromising the secrets that they have developed.
What are the companies and industries that you see that are leading the way, and which ones are the ones that you think, oh, these are probably a bit behind, lagging, quote unquote? So you just said yes. Microsoft is probably has made it finally to come, and probably is going to be one of the big impulses to Web 2.0.
Yes, they are.
So
absolutely.
What other companies or industries?
Well, not surprisingly, it's the information industries where Web 2.0 ideas are most understood and most aggressively pursued. So high technology companies are aggressive in making their intellectual property available. A lot of media companies are putting a lot of their content into the public domain. If you look at the New York Times, for example, which is the leading newspaper, of course, in the United States, what you will find is that there's now a tremendous amount of content on the website, including blogs and ways that individual readers participate in the creation of content. It's very Web 2.0, and it's all free. And they have abandoned their attempts to charge for access to the website. And instead, what they're doing is they are transforming the print product, the printed newspaper, into more of a reflective journal with a smaller number of longer articles that go into greater depth on particular issues. So their model increasingly is that people will get the news from the internet. They will discuss the news on the internet, but they will look to the print paper, the print product, for in-depth analyses of topics which are not strictly dependent on the news cycle, but which are relevant to the news. So the New York Times is redefining itself as a company that is half on the web and a half in the press, in the printed press. and that they have significantly different products in those two worlds. In consumer goods, a lot of companies are changing how they go to market. They're rethinking advertising, they're rethinking promotion, they're rethinking their relationships with their customers. So, I mean, to take an extreme example that is Spanish, I mean, think of an organization like Real Madrid. You know, Real Madrid has fans, something like 200 million fans around the world, not just Spanish people, of course. And, you know, as one of the world's greatest soccer teams, I mean, these fans are really dedicated. So for them, developing a community for their fans is not really very difficult. It already exists. Indeed, the problem is that it is too powerful. The problem for Real Madrid is how do you allow Web 2.0 to support that global community of 200 million fans for the soccer team without losing control of the power of that. Now, for many companies in many rather more boring products than soccer, of course, it's not clear that Web 2.0 is very exciting. But for any organization, any consumer goods company, any media company, where the users are fans, are fanatical, are enthusiastic, are innovative, where they want to contribute, where they want to be heard, where they want to talk to each other about the latest innovation or the latest event, Web 2.0 is an enormously powerful way of going to market. And so a lot of consumer goods companies are exploiting that. Those, I think, are the major areas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans.
Thank you very much.